The 19th century is ebbing away. In the heart of Europe, old dynasties hold on to power. It's a stable, certain, but unequal world. Most ordinary people still accept that it's their place to toil and not to share, to serve and not to question. All that is about to change. A 17-year-old Russian boy saw the 20th century begin.
There were fireworks. There was drinking. There were crowds on the streets. Nobody stayed at home. People started hugging, kissing, making friends and making resolutions. We had huge hopes.
In the new century, some of those hopes were dashed, and many were realized. For millions, there was spiraling danger and cruel abuse. But political power shifted, new freedoms were won, and millions lived longer, healthier, and more prosperous lives than they'd ever expected. This series is the story of those turbulent changes, told by the people themselves.
In my century, we've had electricity, trams, cars, right up to astronauts. This is all my century. It's been fascinating. I'm very pleased with my century.
In 1900, people in the great cities of the West were proud of their achievements and confident of their future. There was rivalry between the European nations, but through careful diplomacy, they'd avoided war for 30 years. And on both sides of the Atlantic, most assumed this peaceful stability would continue.
I would say you had the feeling, well, this is the way it is, this is the way it'll always be. Why would it be different? I never dreamed the world would change the way it did.
The Great Paris Exhibition of 1900 symbolized the hopes of the new century. It drew over 50 million visitors. People believed nations could now compete peacefully and avoid war. Education would reach the masses. Science would transform life at work and at home. Arriving by steam train and horse-drawn bus, visitors could make their way round the exhibition on the newest forms of transport.
Je me souviens très bien de l'exposition de 1900.
I remember the 1900 exhibition. I was 6 years old. I saw these people moving forwards without walking, and it puzzled me. So I asked my mother, and she told me it was a moving pavement, the first ever.
C'est le premier trottoir roulant qui existe. Alors ça m'intéresse.
I thought it was really interesting, and I remember it to this day.
Jusque maintenant.
The ingenious pavement swept people to huge pavilions where nations competed to show off their industrial might. Britain brought the heavy engineering that had made her the leading industrial power for so long. The Germans exhibited their latest machine tools and cars. The United States displayed the growing wealth of the new world power that was now overtaking Europe. Her production efficiency was driving up wages to make American workers the envy of the world. One building was a temple to the energy expected to power the new century. It drew enormous crowds, amongst them Raymond Abescat.
At home we used oil lamps and candles. We didn't have electricity. So here was this whole exhibit devoted to electricity. It was wonderful to see the building all lit up in the evening.
A new piece of music, Waltz of the Lights, was played in electricity's honor. And in Paris in 1900, many had their first sight of the new invention that would transform popular entertainment. Moving pictures in color. The exhibition was held at a time of growing prosperity for many, but not for all.
La Belle Époque, c'était pour les riches.
The Belle Époque was for the rich, people who could dress well and eat well, while your workers got nothing but stewed grease and gristle. It wasn't the Belle Époque for everybody.
C'était pas la Belle Époque pour tout le monde.
Further down the Seine, the poor were occupied with the effort of daily survival. Average life expectancy was 46. Families had to fend for themselves. If they were homeless or out of work, they received no help from the state. The world was a less crowded place. Its population would grow 4 times over in the next 100 years. And most still lived on the land, working in drudgery. Few ever glimpsed the remote political figures or monarchs who ruled their lives. But just occasionally they did.
I saw Queen Victoria. She passed by in a landau. She's just a little old lady in a black cape and a black bonnet. My cousin says, "Oh, that's the old Queen." And then I was there again when she died. I was about 5, I think. And I heard the church bell tolling. I was playing in the yard. And I said, "Oh, church bell's tolling." And Auntie, she said, "Oh, the poor old dear's gone at last."
The solemn state funeral held for Queen Victoria in 1901 was a reminder of all that hadn't changed politically, even at a time of material progress. Two kings, 2 emperors, 24 princes, and 13 royal dukes followed her coffin. This was the old order. A handful of European dynasties, all related to one another, held sway over half the world. The British Empire was largest of all. A cornerstone of national life, it gave people a feeling of superiority over foreigners.
We were sorry for them in a way, eh? And of course, if we saw a coloured man, hey, watch out, he's a darky. Yes. Yeah, we were very, very, very insular, very insular. We felt a kind of pride in our empire. The empire in which the sun never sets.
The proudest possession was India. 290 million Indians had their country run for them by an elite of 5,000 British officials. Africa too was under European domination, the imperial powers competing to exploit its mineral wealth. The Africans themselves were valued only for their labor. They had no real rights. In South Africa, the Dutch and the British had pushed the Africans off their traditional land. Dora Ramotibe worked for a Boer farmer in the Transvaal.
You had to crawl on your knees as you went up to the Boer. You had to crawl, clapping your hands.
Yeah.
The boss used to thrash us. He used to beat us women up a lot, as if we were children. He slapped us and threw us to the ground. He kicked us with his shoe and then told us to stand up. It was a painful life, very, very painful.
Young people's chances of a better life depended on who they were and where they lived. Western children were growing up healthier thanks to improved hygiene. They were better educated than any generation before, as governments brought in free, compulsory education. As more could read, the more they learned about the world. Mass literacy became the greatest single factor in changing people's expectations for their lives. New kinds of newspapers were pitched at this better educated public and sold in their millions. They brought politics to the masses. The largest example of a working democracy was the United States, where all men over 21 had the vote. At elections, politicians now appealed directly to the people.
The principles for which we stand are the principles of fair play and a square deal for every man and every woman in the United States.
The American people regularly voted their leaders in and out of office.
Politics was really hot. You really were a Democrat or a Republican. And people did business with that in their mind. Politics was really very important.
But women still couldn't vote in national elections. And there were others who were missing out. Black American men had the vote in theory, but many in the South dared not use it. John Morton Finney grew up in Missouri.
Negroes in many places could not go to the polls to vote, although the law said they had the right to do so. They couldn't go to the polls. Why? Be lynched. Man may get killed, Negro man, trying to vote.
In Europe, working men's hopes were pinned on new political parties that campaigned for their vote. Britain's Labour Party was founded in 1900. In Germany, 50 socialist MPs had been elected to Parliament. But there was one country where people had no say in how their lives were run, where discontent was most bitter. Though serfdom had ended, 19 million Russian peasants faced lives of hardship and hunger. Sergei Butsko was born in a village in Bielorussia.
Бедность была для половины населения.
Half the population lived in awful poverty.
Помещик нашего
The landowner of our district lived in Warsaw. He spent all his time going to parties.
Кутил, как рассказывали, время от времени.
Every so often he'd show up on his land to collect his money. Then he'd shoot off back to Warsaw.
И вновь уезжал в Варшаву.
Political parties were illegal. There was no parliament. Absolute power was in the hands of one family, the Romanovs. Let all know, Tsar Nicholas declared, that I shall safeguard the principles of autocracy unswervingly. The Tsar's children met their poor subjects at a charity fete, a rare bridging of the gap between the masses and their godlike masters.
Отец всегда хорошо говорил.
My father always said life without a Tsar was impossible. No matter how hard it is for the workers, there should always be a Tsar. In my family, we never said anything against the Tsar. What they said about him at the factory, I don't know.
Я не знаю.
More and more, the talk in the factories was of how to fight the low wages and harsh conditions. Max Kleinman saw the mounting discontent at first hand.
People were dissatisfied. At the meetings, they shouted, "Down with autocracy." They saw the Tsar as a symbol of autocratic rule, and saw that he held Russia tightly in his grasp, and that the people were struggling for survival.
In 1905, workers petitioned the Tsar, saying, "We have been made beggars. We are oppressed. We working men have no voice." The Tsar's reply came when his troops fired on the demonstrators. A wave of strikes spread. The clamor for political reform grew, and a small group of Marxists saw its chance to overthrow the Tsar in all-out revolution. On the barricades in 1905 was Alexander Bryansky.
We all talked and sang revolution.
Пели революционную песню дружно, товарищи в ногу, духом окрепнем в борьбе, братский союз, свободу, грудью проложим свет.
We boys took part on the barricades. I remember how we turned the horse-drawn trams onto their sides. We tipped over the tram which went through Ostrozhnaya Square.
The Tsar was finally forced to promise his people their first representative assembly, the Duma. But few were satisfied. The fires of revolution were not extinguished. Only 12 years later, they'd flare up again, turning Russia into the first workers' state and changing the course of history. From Japan, Russia's neighbor in the Far East, came further challenges to the old order. Only a generation before, Japan had been closed to the outside world and locked into feudalism. Japanese reformers then launched a drive to modernize and catch up with the West.
They widened the streets. When electric lighting was put in, the city got a lot livelier in the evenings. By 1904, the Japanese felt strong enough to fight a war with Russia for dominance in the Far East. They used their new navy to sink the Russian fleet. Japan's triumph challenged the superiority over other races that white people had taken for granted. Mohei Tamura remembers the celebrations. We pulled the drum cart through the village and celebrated for 3 days. Japan won a great victory over Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, and as a result, we didn't fear foreigners. We thought Japan was a country protected by God, and that we would never lose any wars in the future. Our belief was as simple as that, and so we had no fear of foreigners. And they continued to borrow from the West. Mohei Tamura got a job as a salesman for European-style clothes. I knew the world was developing dramatically, but I thought I ought to get a job adapted to this new, changing world. Japan's new self-confidence and her growing industrial skill would help her become a new force in the world. For many Europeans, crowded into city slums, the promise of the modern age was slow to arrive. The wait for political and social improvements in their own countries seemed interminable. The most desperate were the persecuted minorities. In Russia and Eastern Europe, Jews were attacked in a series of pogroms. Despair and poverty led many to try and break with the past completely. In search of a better life, millions set out for the land they'd been told offered tolerance and prosperity, America. Some families could only afford the fare for their children, not themselves. In 1910, Nellie Gillinson sailed for New York.
leaving her parents behind.
I'll never forget the goodbye of my mother. She was squeezing me and I was squeezing her. People wanted to pull me off of my mother, and my mother didn't let me go. And the same thing was and for years, when I thought about it, I was crying. But I never saw my mother or father again.
From Hamburg and Stockholm, Liverpool and Cork, Naples and Genoa, they set out on a journey few were prepared for.
The voyage was very rough, very rough. There wasn't a day that people didn't pray to arrive in America. We were in steerage. We were in steerage, like I would say a flight down in the boat. And we had bunks, double bunks. My mother and my little brother slept down, and we as two children slept on the upper bunks. It was crowded. A lot of people were very sick, especially the elderly people were sick. One day we were playing on the boat, and a sailor was sweeping the floor, and then all of a sudden he started to holler and point. He spoke in a language that I didn't understand, but he was pointing and hollering, "America, America," pointing with his finger. And we all looked, and before you know it, we saw America. We saw the Statue of Liberty. We were all yelling and singing. Oh, it was happiness.
Between 1900 and 1914, over 13 million arrived in America from Europe. It was the greatest voluntary migration ever.
The first step I made on the ground of America, I felt like I wanted to kiss it. And I said, "God bless America."
Nellie Gillinson joined the throng of immigrants packed into New York's Lower East Side. They worked long hours in the city's sweatshops, but for the new arrivals, it was worth it.
New York was, then it was paradise.
The United States, with its modern technology and thrusting capitalism, was well down the road that would lead it to dominate the century. Wealth was rippling out to people who were more educated and mobile than any before. New types of jobs were being done by a growing white-collar class. They were the best-paid workers in the world, and advertising persuaded them what to buy. The new choices that had to be made were sometimes baffling.
In 1900, my father was building a house, and one problem was gas and electricity were just coming in to be used generally. So he asked the head of the company which he should put into the house, gas or electricity. And he said, oh, gas, by all means. Electricity is just a fad. It'll never last. So that's what we got.
The spread of electricity brightened lives in every sense. It lit up a new amusement park, the world's largest, built just outside New York at Coney Island. The thrills and excitement were only one of a growing number of ways that people could use their leisure. The mass entertainment that was growing fastest all over the world was cinema. The first films were widely shown in fairground booths. Amy Sears was taken to see one in 1903.
No, I was thrilled to bits. Oh, I said, look at that. And I was sitting on my dad's shoulders, watching it. Yes, that's the one. He just shook it up and put a little on his hand and started rubbing. Then he rubbed again and a little bit more, and a bit more hair came up, and he just finished up with a lovely head of hair. And I know I was thrilled to bits.
Summer holidays at the coast were a new ritual for many in Europe.
Enfin, j'ai le souvenir de ces trains-là parce que j'avais...
I remember those trains because in 1905 I was 9. This is exactly how it was. All the women in hats. We always wore hats. People got down onto the platform, lots of chatter, and raring to get to the beach just as soon as they possibly could. That was the main thing, to get to the sea. There's a woman with an enormous bathing costume. Look at her. That's exactly how it was. The water's cold there, and the ladies let out little shrieks as they got in. It was very amusing.
And all the time, technology continued to catch the public imagination. In the summer of 1909, Jeanne Plouvin saw history being made on the French coast.
It was quite an event. When we knew that Blériot was going to leave, all of us children in the district, everyone, from the youngest to the oldest, gathered in a field. The corn had been harvested, and so there we stood in this cornfield behind some oil drums, because they didn't let us get too close. It would have been too dangerous.
The first powered flight had been made 6 years before, but no one had yet flown a plane across the channel. Several had crashed in the sea before Louis Blériot set out from Calais.
He was an engineer, a gentleman, very daring, because he knew he was risking his life. We heard the engine rumble. He taxied forward, took off gently, and then was gone. Everyone clapped, everyone shouted. We cried, "Bravo!"
Blériot's journey began smoothly. But then the wind blew him off course. For 10 anxious minutes he lost sight of all land, before finally glimpsing the English coast. He was waved down onto the cliffs of Dover. Word of Blériot's triumph soon got back to Calais, where Jean Plouvin waited with the crowds.
Blériot a réussi la traversée.
Blériot's made it, they shouted on the streets.
Sur les boulevards partout. Et c'était une joie immense.
There was immense joy when we heard that he'd landed in England. Everyone was happy. It was a victory for France.
C'était une victoire française, hein?
Each new achievement of 20th century science was used to boost national prestige. Britain believed it had beaten the world with the largest passenger ship ever made, the Titanic, so advanced that she was said to be unsinkable. But much of the popular faith in experts and engineers was shattered in 1912 on her maiden voyage to New York. Off Newfoundland, the ship struck an iceberg and started to sink. Among the passengers were Benjamin and Esther Hart and their daughter Eva.
My father had put my mother and I into a lifeboat and said to me, "Now be a good girl, hold Mummy's hand," and I thought he was following me. Any child being lifted up and put into a boat like that, you'd think your father was following, but of course he didn't.
The lifeboat pulled clear and Eva Hart watched as the Titanic went down.
You could hear people screaming. It's a dreadful sound. I remember saying to my mother one time, soon afterwards, about the screams and the shrieks of these people, and I always remember, she said, "Yes, but do you remember the silence that followed it?" And I do. And silence is a great thing to me, because I can remember when there was the whole world and this starlit night and these shrieking, drowning people. I think the worst thing of the lot that was. And then this silence, which you couldn't describe.
Over 1,500 people drowned that night. Most of them were men. It was a case of women and children first. The popular depiction of women was as gilded, frail creatures, pinched at the waist, obedient to their husbands. In the early years of the new century, women began a campaign to change the way they were regarded and win the same political rights as men. Many women were now going out to work in offices and factories. Gertrude Jarrett was a suffragette fighting for women's votes.
I thought women were equal to men and should have a say in things. I thought that women should have the same rights as men, and it was a woman's life, and she should say what she wanted, whether it was at Parliament or where it was. A woman should have the same say as a man.
Shout, shout, Africa's song, cry
several of us that were in the votes for women. We used to get in Hamley Market Square and spout a bit. But in those days, the police would, if they got a bit too rowdy, the police would come and move us off. But we still used to say what we thought.
Arrests, followed by hunger strikes in jail, made the fight increasingly bitter and dangerous. One lone suffragette staged the most extreme protest before the crowds at the Derby in 1913. Emily Davison ducked under the rails and stood in front of the King's horse and was killed. The women's campaign was only one of a growing number of new political challenges to the old order. Protest had even begun in the empire. In India, the Congress movement began to talk of the possibility of self-government. In South Africa, simmering discontent led in 1912 to the first political organization for black Africans. Dora Ramotibe was there at the start.
We wanted a better life. We could see that it would come if we joined the Congress. We used to go around the village singing, and people would be drawn to join us.
The fledgling African National Congress began its long struggle with demands for land reform and an end to racial injustice. At the earliest meetings of the ANC, they sang a song called Cry of the Africans. In China, a quarter of the world's population was still ruled by the world's oldest empire. The autocratic Manchu dynasty dealt ruthlessly with any sign of opposition. But in 1911, in the century's biggest political upset so far, the emperor system was thrown out and a republic declared.
No one amongst the ordinary people had been happy. When Sun Yat-sen started the revolution, life got better. The emperor had been deposed. The country was no longer under his thumb.
But the revolution didn't bring the better government people hoped for. Their vast country would be weakened by decades of political chaos and civil war. In the West, the most strident challenge came from industrial workers. More and more joined trade unions to fight for higher pay and shorter hours. They no longer accepted that they should work in the old unquestioning way. The unions flexed their muscles in a series of national strikes which became increasingly violent. In France, martial law was introduced after French railway workers had shown they now had the power to bring the whole country to a standstill. Scotland, 1911. A strikebreaker tried to drive his horse and cart through Union pickets, but the crowd was too strong. As a result of the strike, mill girls like Minnie Way were laid off.
That cattle strike went on for 6 weeks. Yes, 6 weeks exact. And they go down the streets singing, what was it now? We are out for higher wages, as we have a right to do, but we'll never be content till we get the 10%, for we have a right to live as well as you.
Slowly, people started to win those rights. Governments granted shorter working hours and the first old age pensions. And slowly, across Europe, other changes took effect. New government schools and the mass press sharpened people's sense of their own national identity. The spirit of heightened nationalism was embodied in old emperors, enshrined in national myths. The values of the old order, pride, power, territory, were reasserted. And old rivalries between nations were renewed. Governments encouraged people to see their neighbors as foes.
Les Allemands étaient nos ennemis.
The Germans were our enemies, and we were aware of the threat of war with Germany, aware that Germany had a powerful army which was preparing for war, and war against us first, against France.
Contre la France.
The mass of ordinary people fell in behind their leaders. The energy and science of the new age were now turned over to an arms race. Only 5 years after Blériot's pioneering flight, his company was making aircraft for the French army. After 40 years of peace, war seemed inevitable. More young men than ever were learning to fight. By 1914, over 25 million were trained and ready.
We were brought up to spell duty with a big D. And our duty was to God and our country. And that was the end of the matter.
A complex web of treaties ensured that if one country was attacked by another, then the whole continent would be dragged into conflict. July 1914, the funeral of the heir to the Austrian throne shot by a Serbian nationalist in Sarajevo. Austria declared war on Serbia. The people of Europe held their breath. Then, one by one, the alliances came into play. Russia mobilized against Austria. Sergei Butsko remembers talking to his brother that day.
You could already feel the strain and mood of impending disaster in the air. I asked him, "Do you want this war to happen?" "Yes, I do," he answered. "Me too," I said. We really didn't have the slightest idea what was going to happen to us.
In Paris, where the hopes of 1900 had been focused, news of general mobilization reached the streets on August the 2nd. Europe was at war. The century had begun with hopes that material progress and political freedoms would change people's lives. In fact, it was 4 years of war that would trigger the greatest changes, changes beyond the wildest dreams or nightmares of the people of the new century.